Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining this World Energy Council session on balancing pathways to Africa's recovery. May I just point out that the speakers will all be in a position to be able to respond to questions, so please use the chat function as you see fit in order to get any questions into the system, and we'll collectively do our best to ensure that you get good answers to them. Let me come back to the topic. The challenge in talking about a recovery in which, because of the fact that different countries have had different experiences, we need different pathways to recovery, is that recovery isn't going to happen all that quickly. The pandemic, as we all know, has caused a recession on a scale that we haven't seen since World War II. It's overburdened governments and put exceptional pressure on central banks and international financial institutions. It's exposed the fragility of corporate balance sheets and led to liquidations. And it's induced psychological and social stress and financial hardship to most communities and widened social and economic disparity in all. If we put some numbers to that, the IMF's World Economic Outlook from January 2021 shows that world output shrank by 3.5% as against expected growth of 3% before the pandemic in 2020. Output in the advanced economies shrank by 4.9%, in emerging markets and developing economies by 2.4%, and sub-Saharan Africa did scarcely better than that with a shrinkage of 2.6%. And of course, within that, there are huge disparities as well. South Africa's real GDP shrunk by 7.5%, and that of Nigeria by 3.2%. The World Bank estimates that 43 million Africans were pushed back into conditions of extreme poverty. Recovery to the growth trend before 2019, other than in China and perhaps India, will take several years. Africa, according to the IMF, will probably need $1.2 trillion spread over 3 years just to recover. Now, back when the World Energy Council held the Energy Congress 2019 in Abu Dhabi, it was generally agreed that there was a need for digitized innovation ecosystems to secure energy delivery within climate boundaries through a dramatic increase in electrification, deep decarbonization, and a significant shift to the use of renewables, both within smart grids and in microgrids. And in Abu Dhabi, we were talking about every single technology, from coal to gas retrofitting through ammonia, nuclear, and hydrogen, to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And hanging over all of this, we had the challenge of over 2,000 gigawatts of coal-fired plants, largely in Asia, with a potential residual economic lifespan of 40 years. So the need for transition pathways to a future of energy security, social equity, and environmental sustainability, which many of you will recognize as the World Energy Council's energy trilemma, was the backdrop that almost everyone, including significantly, I think, the oil ministers of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, used to frame these discussions. Now, 2020 is going to be a remarkable year in this context. There's COP26 in Glasgow. There's President Biden's re-engagement with the Paris Agreement and determination to hold a climate summit. His commitment that the US will have net zero emissions by 2050, and even more remarkably, an emissions-free electric grid by 2035. This has changed the game. And it's also broadly in line with climate targets that have been announced by China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. In parallel with that, EU Commission President von der Leyen has described the European Green Deal as a moonshot to place the EU at the forefront of the energy transition. And leading oil companies, initially BP Amoco to the fore, but subsequently Shell and others, have developed scenarios and business strategies to reduce their CO2 emissions radically. And most recently, Bill Gates has written a tech-heavy book entitled How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. So the issue on the agenda this year is dealing with climate. If we assume that the COVID-19 pandemic has given us an opportunity to review and restructure the energy landscape through new thinking, a growing range of innovative technologies and means to generate clean energy, and if we assume these have to be used to catalyze an economic recovery, then the question is, what pathways are available for that purpose in Africa? And we have a fantastic panel here this afternoon to try and answer that question for all of us. Firstly, we have Professor Abubakar Sani Sambo. We have Ryan Collier, the Chief Executive Officer of Rosatom Central and Southern Africa. We have Cecilia Njenja, the head of the United Nations Environmental Programme Office for South Africa. We have Luc Cochlin, the Vice President for Southern Africa of the EDF Group, Electricité de France. And we have Olubenga Olubanzo, founder and CEO of Reedy Technologies. We have 5 different perspectives on probably the most critical issue of the time. I'm going to ask each of you to consider in simple terms what pathways to resilience are most needed. What are the largest energy transition challenges in the race to zero? What successes have you seen to date in meeting the need to humanize the strategy, to match social equity with environmental sustainability? And what policy shifts can we anticipate in order to enable us to meet those challenges? Professor Abubakar, may I come to you first to give us a framing account in respect of that?
Yes, thank you very much, Shin, for that excellent background. Well, COVID-19, as I believe all of us already know, and the subsequent lockdowns brought hardships to virtually all countries of the world. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, the zone was very hard hit because the majority of sub-Saharan Africans live on daily subsistence, and so many of them were at the verge of starvation. And of course, this is because the majority of the economies were very weak even before the pandemic. And therefore, the major focus, having got some of the economies to enter economic recession, the major focus of the recovery is first and foremost to strengthen the economy, reduce poverty, and thereafter to ensure that whether another pandemic comes or any other disruptions, the African countries will not suffer as they are still currently suffering. And the focus of most of them, not only those like my own, which is an oil-rich country that depends largely on the income from sale of oil, but even the others, they are all determined to look at the various comparative advantages they have. And the first and foremost area is that of agriculture. I've looked at the strategies of many sub-Saharan African countries. They want to focus on large-scale agriculture and agro-allied industries, but with due consideration for smallholder farmers as well. And the second area I've seen is that so many sub-Saharan African countries are committed to exploit the solid minerals endowments they have, not only the mines, but also the mineral processing plants they want to set up. And of course, the third area that I see so many African countries are interested very much in going into now more than ever before is manufacturing sector, again, based on the various comparative advantages. And the fourth area I've had and I listened to so many Africans talk about is they're going to strengthen their tourism sites. Now, for all these four major areas to be strengthened and developed, the major requirement is that of round-the-clock electricity. And for large part of the continent, also security has to be improved upon. The issue of round-the-clock electricity, one needs to look at the annual average electricity consumption per capita of sub-Saharan Africa, which is very low, just about 500 kilowatt hour, while the world average is approaching 3,000. And this is a very major concern that can be taken care of by looking at the net zero move as contained in the African Union's Agenda 2060 by focusing significantly more on renewable energy electrifications, of course, to circumvent the problem of the mighty grid, mini grids will have to be the way to go. And then there will have to be, for big countries, we can't have a single national grid. The grid should be regionalized. That will help a lot. And then, of course, there has to be country-to-country interconnections and regional interconnections. And for this, I remember very well the program for integration, infrastructural development of Africa, PIDA, which is also a project of the African Union, through which the 5 regional interconnections are poised to be sorted out. If that is done, that will strengthen the electricity supply from one part of the country to this. Immediately talking about this, the project that comes to mind is the one we've been talking about for so long. That's the 50,000 megawatt capacity Grand Inga, which at various meetings, all parts of the continent would like to utilize the electricity from there. And then associated with this, there was another old project that was discussed, especially from Europe, the Desertec project. That kind of project with the very low carbon footprint that is going to have has to be brought into context. And then I've served in a number of meetings, where some of our countries express interest in nuclear power, and 2-3 countries are thinking of coming together to develop nuclear power plants for use. Say ECOWAS. ECOWAS, I know Ghana and Nigeria are thinking of nuclear power plant, and more recently Niger wants to join in that discussion as well. So I think the nuclear power plants, the big hydropower plants could be taken on a regional perspective. That strategy will help solve a lot of the energy problems we're having.
Thank you very much, Professor Abubakar. I think that's been a very helpful overview touching on all of the key frameworks. Cecilia, may I turn to you next, and may I just, before asking you to speak, congratulate you on UNEP's 50th anniversary today and the challenges that lie ahead in respect of the others. I think it's a remarkable achievement to have been around for 5 decades and made the contributions that UNEP has made to the world in that period. So over to you. I'd really like to hear your perspective, specifically from a South African perspective, but also more generally as you see fit.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you for congratulating UNEP. It's really a great pleasure for us to be celebrating 50 years. Indeed, we cannot talk about a post-COVID-19 green recovery without talking about energy. We do see the transition as being so crucial for us, not only in expanding electricity service to the unserved communities across Africa's rural and informal settlements, but also in terms of reducing over-reliance on unsustainable sources such as coal. Energy production and use is the single biggest contributor to global warming. And we do know that transitioning to clean and sustainable energy does lay the foundation for a just, resilient, low emission economic and societies around the world. At UN Environment, and even as we celebrate 50 years, we believe that sustainable energy presents a huge, huge opportunity for a post-COVID-19 green recovery that will transform lives, will transform communities wherever they are, big or small, while safeguarding the planet. And that's why, for us, we are working with stakeholders here in South Africa to help them improve energy efficiency and also to increase the use of renewables in their various provinces, cities, and also at the national level. We believe very strongly, and we've been working with stakeholders, including government, private sector, energy generators, that green policies can actually promote a higher economic activity, create employment, but at the same time, have cut significantly carbon dioxide emissions. And in South Africa, the greenhouse gases emissions targets will be necessary to avoid the lock-in to higher carbon emissions that's often associated with coal-fired power stations. And so, Sean, the transition to a low-carbon economy inevitably will involve more activity in the sectors in the low-carbon supply chain and less activity in coal mining. As Professor Abubakar said, he mentioned agriculture, for instance. We are looking at sustainable agriculture. We are also looking at the entire value chain of agriculture and seeing points of entry where we can introduce sustainable energy, such as in areas as drying of farm produce, refrigeration using solar, etc., which are readily available technologies nowadays. Like other countries with a significant fossil fuel extraction industry, South Africa will need just transition policies to support those individuals and communities. And there are several millions of them that are dependent on jobs and livelihoods in coal industry. So in this just transition, we are not forgetting those particular individuals. But I'd just like to share very quickly, using one of the models we have been looking at, the Green Push scenario model for South Africa, and just to see if it was interfaced or integrated into the business as usual current policy model that they are using, that we would move much more faster and quicker if we had a green push approach towards decarbonizing power generation system that is currently planned. We have tested the impact of a stronger push towards decarbonizing the power generation system. And we have also made a couple of assumptions and said that the funding required for these investments is available both in public and private hands and would be very easily secured, and investments would come into South Africa in the renewable energy sector with really not much, with ease, I would say that. We're also seeing that there are policy incentives that are still required for renewable electricity and energy, and therefore also support power generation that would really cover the entire country and ensure that the inequities country currently experience by having some communities really cut off from the grid would benefit from off-grid, would benefit from renewable sources and also affordable and clean energy, even for cooking, which is a mainstay for our women in the rural area. So there is opportunities. And I think what I'm trying to emphasize here is that transition to renewable energy has numerous and multiple benefits, not just for purposes of reducing carbon emissions, but also in terms of socioeconomic transformations for the people of South Africa.
Thank you, Cecilia. We'll dig a little further into that in the second round. Thank you very much for framing it so well. Luke, I'm going to come to you for an obvious reason at this moment. The emphasis has been on electrification to an appreciable degree, both by extending the grid and in microgrids, off-grid as it were. And EDF, of course, sits at the center of that sort of activity. What's your view as to best paths for a humane recovery?
Thank you very much, Sean. Yes, indeed. I believe that the pandemic and its impact shows that the continent cannot afford anymore to lack of energy. When we see that 2 points of GDP have been lost in South Africa last year due to load sheddings, we can see that everybody realizes now that no economic recovery is possible without energy. The good point in that is that the pandemic, in my opinion, doesn't affect the private equity availability for electricity projects. For example, at EDF, there is no cut in our investment budget for international projects. Even if we are paying attention in our costs in head costs, etc. in France, investment in Africa will not be affected by this. And we are not the only one. Most of the players I know are not going to cut their investment. What I believe is required is that, on one hand, I think we need to unlock the private sector involvement. For example, the regulation for distributed energy and off-grid activities. As you said, EDF is extremely involved in off-grid and distributed energy in Africa because it's the only way to meet the people's needs. But in many countries, including South Africa, it's still extremely locked by the regulation. So that's a key point. On the other hand, nothing is also possible without strong involvement of governments in terms of visibility and planification. We are not going to meet the needs of the people just with distributed energy and off-grid and solar. There is also a need for nuclear IPP, a strong base load, for a solid grid also. And there is a need for giving confidence to investors. And also the role of government is to use all of this to promote social justice and local development. So there is a strong need for involvement from governments. Another point I would like to mention is that everybody focuses on the generation. So everybody wants to build additional generation plants. But the cheapest electricity is electricity you don't use. And there is also a strong need for energy efficiency. That was my biggest surprise when I came to South Africa from Europe, is to see how much energy is wasted. And in the meantime, we don't have enough energy in the country. So there is also a strong role from governments to promote energy efficiency through building regulation, through tax incentive, etc. And last, sorry.
No.
And last, I would like also to mention, it has already been mentioned, but I want to also underline the need for country cooperation, not only for interconnection, there is a strong need for interconnection, but also for sharing resources. So you mentioned INGA, of course, everybody knows INGA, but there is a lot of other projects which are not possible without country cooperation or regional cooperation. I can mention Mpanda and Kua in Mozambique, which won't be possible without an offtake from South Africa, and many other projects that can be done only if countries are cooperating.
Thank you very much, Luke. Just a slightly facetious observation. Clearly, those who were present in Berlin at the time at which boundaries in Africa were drawn did not have a 21st century approach to ensuring adequate, efficient energy supply to all of the inhabitants of the continent. And Ryan, that takes me logically, not least because Luke referred to the role of nuclear within the overall mix, to Rosatom. What's your perspective on what's required?
Thank you very much, Sean. I think COVID has certainly, if anything, highlighted the gaps between Africa and the developed world. I think more than anything, it shone a light on not just the state of the healthcare sector, but also basic utilities, particularly access to clean water and electricity. I'm very hopeful, though, that the crisis caused by the pandemic will do certain things such as accelerate trends towards digitalization, regional cooperation, as well as impose opportunities in terms of local manufacturing and meaningful local participation in infrastructure projects on the continent. In terms of energy progress on the continent, I think East Africa and particularly Kenya appears to be performing very well in recent years, which is highlighted in the World Energy Trilemma Index. Progress in Kenya can be attributed to exactly what Luke was talking about earlier, a combination of factors, but largely driven by effective government policy. Although from a rather low base, sub-Saharan Africa in general has also made quite a lot of progress in terms of household electrification over the past years. The number of people gaining access to electricity for the first time has outpaced population growth at roughly 20 million new connections a year. While household connections and focusing on the humanitarian aspect is vitally important, I do feel we need to pay equal attention in terms of the African Union's ambitious Agenda 2063 master plan, which envisages Africa's transformation into a global powerhouse of the future. Africa essentially skips over the second and third industrial revolutions. The continent is home to 16% of humanity, but only less than 1% of the world's billion-dollar companies and 4% of global GDP. While Africa certainly can't afford to miss the fourth industrial revolution, it should also be focusing on beneficiating the vast amounts of resources under its soils. But beneficiation and industrialization require large amounts of reliable, affordable, and hopefully clean energy. Although Africa is a minor contributor to global greenhouse emissions, and this remains the case in most of the forecasts going forward, Africa is on the front line when it comes to the effects of climate change, in particular its energy sector. Increased frequency of intensity of extreme weather conditions, such as droughts and floods, increase instability of generation in the region, particularly when it comes to large-scale hydro. Zambia's severe drought in 2015, for instance, resulted in prolonged power outages across the country. Uncertainty over the impact of climate change on the region's weather conditions further supports the need to build a diverse energy mix, as well as to bolster regional connections through the existing power pools. Planning and investments need to be done very carefully, and the decisions need to be made in terms of climate resilience. I therefore find it very interesting that while many African nations are actively exploring the option to include nuclear energy in their energy mixes to mitigate these mentioned issues, the fact that it's greatly overlooked by international energy agencies and funds who seem to be fixated with solar PV, wind and gas as the answer to all of Africa's energy problems. While I've got no issues with any of these energy sources, and I fully support a diversified energy mix that can be bolstered in the short term, we must be cognizant of the long term and acknowledge that many of the top performers in the World Energy Trilemma Index have a combination of both nuclear and renewable sources to effectively balance their energy trilemma. In fact, of the top 5, Switzerland has over 30% nuclear, Sweden over 40%, Finland 18%, and France over 70% nuclear. We also need to take into consideration the developments made in small modular reactors, as well as the potential of distributing power from large-scale NPPs through the existing power pools. Thank you.
That was a very helpful overview in the first instance, Ryan. Thank you very much. And it was also a sage reminder of the contribution that nuclear can make to the mix overall. Olubenga, I'm going to come to you now. First of all, because you're the face of the future, you must be at least 50 years younger than I am. And secondly, because in the Reedy group that you've created for this particular purpose, you are pushing the boundaries in respect of some of the solutions within the African space. Tell us your view.
Yeah, again, I'm gonna say I've been able to get a lot of nice perspectives from Cecilia, Ryan, Professor Sambo, and Luke. Obviously, I'm not gonna start discussing how important energy is to actually taking how energy is to moving Africa to the next level as regard like getting that resilience pathway. But like something I'm gonna stand basically most on what Luke mentioned, which is not focusing just on generation, which has been one of the biggest parts where a lot of African energy needs have been focused on now. So you see a lot of like private prastata, government prastata, heavily focusing on generation, which is very good. But the challenge is that African energy challenges goes beyond just generation. So there's a lot of generation going on, but there's a lot of waste. I don't know, is it Luke or Ryan said the cheapest energy is actually the energy you don't pay for. So we actually have a lot of like cheap energy actually present now in Africa that are not being effectively utilized. Like for example, in Nigeria generates most of the energy generated in Nigeria and actually not doesn't perfectly trickle down to the consumers. So you see that very big challenge, even though everybody there's been kind of a very skewed focus towards scaling up generation. The existing distribution infrastructure are aging. Majority of people, there's a lot of energy theft in the market, which is a lot of discos are not able to like correct revenue effectively from the energy they're supplying. And that's why we approach energy from a more bottom-up perspective, where we look at the consumers and we look at what the consumer needs, and now give it back to like how the energy is generated. We are looking at we approach it with something we call the battery as a service model, where we look at how can we allow consumers to access energy the same way they buy a biscuit. So we look at it like if you look at a typical African community, we have this small mom and pop shop in these communities, and how do you leverage on this existing infrastructure to actually effectively distribute energy to these people? So besides like generating at scale through solar farms, through nuclear, some of these guys, even if you have to build a nuclear plant, it's going to take another probably 2 or 3 years to wire like most of these communities. So we look at, okay, we have these challenges. How can we make energy as easy as buying biscuits? And that's what we are doing at Ready actually. We built a technology, a proprietary technology that help us do that. And we've actually also webbed that with a very customer-centric business model. And this business model was designed such that it fits perfectly into a typical African landscape. Like, you know, there's a lot of like the spending power for a typical African is pretty low. So that means if you are building a system, you have to build a system that makes accessing that energy very, very affordable to them. And for us at Ready, what we tried to do was to look at it from the renter perspective. So instead of people paying an upfront money to like access all these energy structures, why not do it such a way that they just have to pay a very token, like just 50 cents or 20 cents to just access the energy they need. And that actually leads to also like very, very huge efficiency. That means you only pay for what you use. And if for us, it allows us to also help to optimize energy generation, both for ourselves and for also like our partners, which can be small mini grid companies or even even discos. So we are looking at energy from a much more innovative perspective, a much more customer focused perspective, and we've actually rolled out models that just connects to how customers behave. And then this is possible also because of we are leveraging on a lot of like technology, a lot of software technology, a lot of like battery technology, a lot of lithium ion tech, and again building that also into like leveraging on existing infrastructure. So that makes that kind of distribution for us very cheap. So we like, instead of people wiring capsules, we just leverage on, instead of people sending wires to homes, they can actually use like the capsule that we've developed to actually access the same energy. And when we're developing that also, we look specifically around what customers need, and we observe that customers need both AC and DC power. So instead of trapping them just in the DC power where they're just like they're just trapped in just using DC, we built a model so that it affords them to access both AC and DC power, which gives them the same energy that they will access if they have actually been wired, if a wire has been sent from a nuclear plant or a mini grid to their homes. So we are looking at those very unique perspectives, and there's been a very solid support from a lot of like African governments too. there's a lot of money being provided out to actually support some of these new business models, but new technologies. But again, I think there's also been a challenge understanding very new business model in the African communities, especially across government. There's been a lot of challenges on kind of embracing some of these new business models, obviously because of the risks associated with new stuff. But we are just very excited about the openness, and COVID-19 has made energy something. COVID-19 has made energy a critical infrastructure that will be needed for Africa to grow to the next level.
Good.
Thank you.
Olu, thank you very much indeed. As I said, you represent the future to an appreciable degree in respect of this, and I'm quite sure that all of the professional players in the space already are listening very carefully and thinking about how to make their businesses increasingly customer-centric. Yep. Cecilia, let me swing back to you, if I may, because in a certain sense, it relates to key observations that have been made by Luke, Ryan, and Olu. All triggered, in one sense, by something that you said right at the beginning, piggybacking on Professor Abubakar's observation. You made the point about, firstly, the need for effective regulation to facilitate transformation in these areas, and secondly, the need to get more players into the environment, and that's the reason that I'm now piggybacking that off Olu. But you probably know, I'm sure you know, that President Ramaphosa, in his State of the Nation address last week, made the observation that government will soon be initiating the procurement of an additional 11,800 megawatts of power from renewable energy, natural gas, battery storage, and coal, he said, after the publication of the Integrated Resource Plan, and the winners of contracts to supply 2,000 megawatts of emergency electricity will be selected soon. Another 2,000 megawatts from solar and wind plants will be sought in the coming weeks, followed by an additional call for projects in August. The only reason I'm citing that is I'm interested in your view on the extent to which, as you look at it from the perspective of South Africa preeminently, we are starting to see a firmer alignment of government policy behind transformation of the energy sector in that regard. What do you feel?
We are definitely pleased by those statements that the president has made, and we believe that a political will at the highest level would be, to some level, a promise that the real transformation and the transitions to a low carbon economy will come to reality. I think, as I think it's Luke who mentioned, we still have huge regulatory gaps, particularly with regard to the private sector. I mean, government will require huge investments in the grid network to allow for renewables to plug in. And basically, that's what the private sector is asking. They want to be plugged onto the grid. They want to be able to sell their excess energy or the energy they develop into the grid, and that's what's really required. And so some of the fundamental things, changes that are required in the infrastructure, in policy, in dialogue, even at the local city level and local government level, are actually very small. If we were to agree and make those small changes in legislation to allow for a broad-based stakeholder engagement, to allow the private sector to play, to allow communities who want to generate, including a school in a rural area that wants to generate and will have excess energy and would want to plug it back to the grid to be able to do that. I think that's where we want to be. I think in the issue of the energy mix, it's every country is looking for an energy mix that's viable, an energy mix that can put them on a sustainable pathway. I think on the point of nuclear, it is also a source of energy, and we recognize it as such. But I think, of course, we in Africa, what we are arguing and saying is that let's look at the most cost-effective and efficient pathway. And renewable energy is available. It's available, it's provided by nature. It can be harnessed. We don't need new technologies to harness it. We can be able to calculate the cost, the risk, etc., and the efficiencies it can deliver. And basically, maybe that's where we need to look a little bit deeper on the model we use in terms of, developing our energy mix model for the country.
Thank you, Cecilia. What I think is vital in the closing minutes of this session, we have about 12 minutes of discussion left, is to try to answer the question as to how we can make these changes occur at scale. I think if we did a quick poll, all of us would agree that we need sustainable, as far as possible, renewable baseload. We need higher levels of connectivity, both within country and cross-border. We need the availability of energy to those, whatever the number is, between 650 million and 1 billion Africans who do not have access to modern energy under present circumstances. And we need to decarbonize and increase the efficiency of the sector as far as possible. These are more or less self-evident today. And to an appreciable degree, technologies, including digital technologies for energy efficiency in particular, are available in order to address these particular challenges. A large part, and Professor Abubakar, I'm coming to you on this question, a large part of the challenge seems to be the inability to engage government, regulators, and private sector collectively in order to be able to address these challenges in an integrated way. Abubakar, what do you see happening in that space? Can organizations like, in the first place, UNEP, in the second place, World Energy Council and others, play a role in enhancing competence to enable government, regulators, and the private sector to engage constructively around these challenges?
Yes, Shane, definitely the World Energy Council and such groups, such development partners like UNEP can play positive roles in solving the energy problem of Africa. I say this because what the two organizations are doing, as we have had from Cecilia, and also as you heard from me, and even from your background information, definitely if African countries move into those directions and then they retool, repackage, and re-strategize, then not only they are going to solve their energy deficiencies, but they are going to move towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's nothing better than some of the things we've highlighted today. And I will bring one other area, you've just mentioned it. Integrated resource planning will be one key area to come. And then strengthening the issue of cooperation. That is key. That is the way forward. I have had the issue, you see, the complexities of our countries are different. While Africa has highest level of renewable energy endowments in terms of solar energy and wind, at the same time, there is substantial deposits of uranium in Africa. Nigeria, Niger, there's a large deposit. In fact, France and America are taking the uranium from Niger. That of Nigeria is untouched. Then in the Southern Africa area, there is also uranium. So while we should do more renewable energy, solar, wind, biomass, biofuels, and hydro, we should also expand the mix significantly and attain higher levels of energy trilemma by bringing in nuclear for those countries that can afford it, those countries that can team together to solve the problem. So the more the better, the more the higher level. And in fact, if you look at the details of some of us that we have been talking about, energy efficiency and conservation should be one of the areas to promote significantly. If we all bring this into the basket, I think definitely Africa is going to be changed for the better.
Thank you, Abubakar. Luke, I'm going to come to you with a challenge in respect of this, and I don't mean for 1 second that you need to commit EDF to something in the course of a panel this afternoon. But we often, I think, when we have to meet these types of challenges in African environments, I think back to the launch of the NEPAD, and prior to that, the construct of African Renaissance, which gave rise to the NEPAD, and to a significant degree, the transformation of the African Union, out of that, Africa 2063. In all of those circumstances, the argumentation was premised on partnerships between Africa and the European Union and the G7, was the way it was put in the context of the NEPAD. And then within Africa, partnerships between governments, the private sector, and civil society. And the argument behind this was that no single sector has all the skills, the knowledge, and the competences necessary to be able to resolve large challenges. Olu's approach to this, which is an absolutely central and critical approach to the whole, is to take it bottom up, to work from the perspective of the consumer and meet his needs. In addition to that, we have to work top down and east-west and north-south in terms of cross-border. The difficulty is that whereas we seem to be very good at talking about it, we're not terribly good at executing it. You've had to sit in a large, challenging organization, which has both private and public sector history, if I can put it that way. What's your thought about how we might address this problem constructively?
It's a very difficult question. I don't think that I have all the answers, but I fully agree that every large project and challenges like the energy challenges of Africa need the involvement of private sector, government, and international institutions. Clearly, all of them have to work together. You're right. For me, the most missing point now is a sustainable commitment and of governments. That's a big problem that we find in most of the countries in Africa. But that's an issue we've got also in Europe, because energy is a very highly political issue. And the customers are also most of the time the voters. So planning on the long term, it's getting more and more difficult for governments. However, they cannot avoid that. And they have to have the courage to face that and not only looking at the short term, the next election, but planning on the long term, avoiding also all the fights between the different players and different lobby group, etc. For example, I give you an example. My surprise in South Africa is to see how the fight between the pro-nuclear and pro-renewables has been blocking the country, and I'm also missing the pro-coal, has been blocking the country project over the last 10 years, and even more than 10 years. And the load sheddings we've got now in South Africa are mainly due to this opposition between the people that shall work together to meet the country needs.
Let me just remark in respect of that those of us who are older remember when Westcor off the back of Inga was going to be the solution, and as a consequence of that we ended up with both collapse of the energy infrastructure and then a whole series of new coal builds as a consequence of it. I think in a certain sense we all know the problem. It's the nature of the problem is unfortunately repetitive, however, and that's the challenge that I'm trying to grapple with. Ryan, in 2 minutes, right? But what are the top 2 things that you think need to be done to address the challenges we're talking about? Don't tell us more about the problems. We know about the problems.
All right.
2 practical suggestions in terms of addressing.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the top two things, we need policy that, like you said, actually is fulfilled. So good policy is one thing. We need people that actually follow through with good policy. The next thing is we need an environment where we can bring private investment in. So an environment that's comfortable. Investors will come in when they feel that things are bankable, that they understand that they will get their return on investment, and they'll understand how long that's going to take, right? So when you introduce policy and legislation that frames that and makes PPAs possible and straightforward, when it opens up these type of things, you get an environment where we can now bring private investment in, and private investment will push things forward. Currently, you've got, I think, about 90% of infrastructure projects in Africa funded by either governments, taxpayers' money, or by fund or by donors from abroad. And both of those things are vitally important, but it's not going to be sufficient to get to where we need to be. If we look at how much energy we need in Africa and the 600 million people that we need to put on the grid and the industry we want to grow and the minerals we want to beneficiate, there needs to be an effort from absolutely everyone, private sector, government, and the public, to make these things go forward.
Thank you, Ryan. And I'm going to turn to the voice of the future. Olu, back to you. But I'm going to ask you the same question. If you could control outcomes today, what are the two things that you would press for and execute as fast as possible to address these challenges, to ensure that your generation and the one following that have clean electricity that enables participation in a modern economy in the 21st century?
If I'm to repeat, thank you so much for that question, Shane. If I'm to repeat, Ryan, I'm going to say investment is strictly important. It actually controls every single innovation and how innovation is being approached. But something that's also very critical in the African context is also data. So like the challenge, there's a lot of challenges around like where is who are electrified and who are not electrified. There's a lot of guesstimate going on in the system. We have actually, there's been some good progress with like the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria. Obviously World Energy Council is also doing some good work in that space where everybody's trying to like gather this efficient data to map where exactly are the what area have like energy access, what area has no access, what area has limited access. So I think that that energy mapping is very, very important. But beyond that mapping also, I think the mapping has to be sustainable, because the mapping is done in such a way that it's just a start, like there's no continuum. So what I mean is that it's not sustained. So when you collect the data of this community for this particular period, you can't say a particular community can have maybe 90% of electrification this period. But you know, this community grows. Africa is a very young community. People are growing, people are expanding. And by the next 5 years, that community might actually have either maybe 100% or have dropped to like 50. But you can see that some of these data points are static, and they are not built such a way that the data structures are not built such that you could actually keep updating those data for people to now build more innovations on those data points. So I think there needs to be like a lot of data collection needs to be sustainably improved, so that it is a cycle process where it keeps updating, so that folks like Cecilia, Professor Lambo, Luke, and Ryan will be able to they will understand what exactly is going on. And when investors are also coming on, they know they can see what are the loopholes and how they could actually effectively close some of those gaps.
Thank you very much. I think we now have to draw it to a close. So I'm going to make 3 observations, if I may, which I think flow out of what you've said. The first is there's no one size fits all. There never has been, and there won't be in any of our lifetimes. We have to have baseload. We have to have means of reaching out to enable modern energy, which means electricity in practical terms, or access to electrical energy for those who currently lack that access today. We have to be able to create better interconnectivity within the continent. We have to ensure that we have as much reduction of greenhouse gas emissions as we can possibly achieve, and we have to ensure that the energy that we provide is both effective and sustainable. Now, we can bemoan the inefficacy of government regulation. We can bemoan the existence of vested interests. We can bemoan all of the things that we could all recite for 20 minutes. But all of us are citizens. And the most important thing about democracy as a form of government and governance as a means of causing an improvement in the well-being of citizens is that citizens have to take accountability. Every one of you, and I include myself in that, has knowledge, skills, capabilities, and responsibilities in respect of this. And I think we must all find a way collectively to be able to address these challenges substantively. Don't let's find ourselves in 12 months from now reciting what we know about the obstacles and piously reciting what needs to be done. Let's be able to record what we've actually done to move the needle, to be able to achieve the outcomes that we all know are critically important. Cecilia, not only because you are the only thing that saves this panel from being completely gender irresponsible, but also because you represent an organization which not only is celebrating its 50th birthday, but which in a rather splendid piece, which Brookings has just published, has been challenged to operate for the future as the light that enlightens other United Nations specialized agencies, programs, and funds, as well as governments across the world, to be able to address these challenges in a substantive way. That doesn't mean UNEP contains all the knowledge that is necessary for this purpose, but if it were to act as an integrative, enlightening agency, drawing on the skills and talents of the sort of people who were assembled for this panel today, and be able to do that at scale, I think it too could play an extraordinary role in enabling Africa's transformation towards not only recovery, but achievement of what its children deserve in respect to the future. So may I thank you all for your participation, and may I once again invite those of you who are listening to this to submit any questions that you have to our panelists in order to take forward, and to join me in thanking them very warmly for the contributions that they've made to this topic this afternoon. Thank you very much all.